The morning I walked into the immigration office with a fake smile and a ring I had bought from a pawn shop 3 days earlier, I told myself this was the most rational decision I had ever made. My name is Robin Foster. I am 26 years old. I have a master's degree in environmental science that I cannot use in this country without a work visa, and I had approximately 42 days left before my student visa expired, and I would be legally required to board a plane back to a life I had spent 7 years running away from. So, marriage. It made sense on paper. What did not make sense on paper, and frankly did not make sense off paper either, was the man sitting across from me in that government waiting room, looking like he had never been inconvenienced by anything in his entire life. Tommy Hardy. The name suited him in a way that felt almost unfair. He was tall, not just tall but broad-shouldered and unhurried about it. The kind of man who took up space in a room and somehow made everyone around him feel like they had been given a gift rather than crowded out. His hair was dark and just long enough that it curled slightly at his temples, and his eyes were the color of deep amber when the light hit them at the right angle, which the fluorescent bulbs of the immigration office very much were not, and yet he still looked infuriatingly attractive. I had met him through a mutual friend. That was the version I planned to tell the immigration officer. The truth was that I had met him through a very sketchy private Facebook group called Visa Solutions, discreet and professional, which sounded exactly as alarming as it was, and which I had joined at 2 in the morning on a night when the alternative was researching one-way plane tickets back to a place I had not called home in 7 years. But Tommy had come recommended. 3 separate people in that group had said he was reliable, discreet, fair, and this was the part that had made me both relieved and slightly suspicious, not interested in anything romantic or physical. He needed the arrangement for his own reasons, which he had explained to me in a coffee shop 4 weeks ago in a voice so calm it felt like he was discussing the weather. I had arrived to that meeting 10 minutes early, because arriving early is how I manage anxiety by turning passive waiting time into active preparation time, which is a coping mechanism my therapist has both validated and gently suggested I examine. The coffee shop was small, slightly too warm, and smelled of ground beans and ambition. I had chosen the table near the window because it offered a clear sight line to the door and the ability to leave quickly if necessary. Tommy Hardy had arrived exactly on time, which I would later understand was his version of being early. He had looked around once, found me without difficulty despite having only seen a single photo, and crossed the room with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never needed to look uncertain to seem approachable. He had sat down, ordered water without looking at the menu, and folded his hands on the table with the particular kind of stillness that made you feel like the conversation was already underway. "I appreciate you meeting me," he said. "The situation is mutual," I said. "I understand you have terms." "I do." A pause just long enough to be considered rather than awkward. "But I'd rather hear yours first." I had not expected that. I had prepared a careful list of my own requirements. Privacy, financial clarity, realistic expectations about the performance required, and I had expected to be presenting them defensively, justifying each one. He had simply asked as though my terms were the natural starting point. I told him what I needed: the visa pathway, 2 years of cohabitation evidence, enough financial support to cover the legal costs and give me stability while I pursued the fellowship applications. I told him I expected privacy and mutual respect. I told him I did not expect friendship, but I did expect basic human courtesy. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded once. "My terms," he said. "I need a legally documented spouse by my 30th birthday, which is 8 months from today. My grandfather established the company 30 years ago, and his will requires that I be married before taking the controlling shares, or they revert to my cousin. The arrangement needs to be convincing enough to withstand scrutiny from people who know me well. A beat. I should tell you that my family is thorough. They will look for inconsistencies. I can be consistent," I said. He looked at me for a moment with those amber eyes. Not sizing me up exactly, more like he was paying attention in the specific way he had with everything, absorbing information rather than judging it. "I believe you," he said. "And you can't just find someone to actually marry?" I asked because I thought it was a fair question, and I was not in the business of assumptions. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, not quite dismissal, something in between. "I could," he said, But this is cleaner. I had thought about that word for days afterward. Cleaner. What a word to use about a human relationship. It implied that relationships came with mess, which was obviously true, but also that the mess could be avoided with sufficient structure, which I was not sure I believed but wanted to. But then again, I was the one who had joined a Facebook group called Visa Solutions, so I was not exactly operating from a place of moral superiority. We had signed a contract 2 weeks later, a real one, drafted by a lawyer that Tommy had sourced and paid for, that outlined the terms with the kind of specificity usually reserved for business partnerships, which was, I supposed, what this was. We would live together in his apartment for the duration required to establish proof of cohabitation. We would attend any interviews together and maintain a consistent story about our relationship. We would be respectful of each other's privacy and personal autonomy at all times. Neither party would invite third parties into the shared living space without advance notice. Neither party would make demands on the other's time beyond what was contractually necessary. There was a financial arrangement. He covered my legal fees and a monthly stipend that I had negotiated down slightly because accepting the full amount made me feel strange in a way I could not articulate. I provided the marriage and the performance of a convincing partnership. At the end of 2 years, we would file for an amicable divorce. Clean, simple, rational. The ring he had bought me was beautiful, actually. A simple band with a small inlaid stone that caught light like a secret, not ostentatious, nothing that announced itself, but genuinely lovely in the way of something chosen rather than grabbed. I had not expected that. I had expected something obviously utilitarian, something that said, this is a prop. This one said something else, though I was careful not to think too hard about what. When he had given it to me, in the lawyer's office of all places with the contract sitting between us and the lawyer tactfully examining some papers, he had said, I thought you should have something you'd actually want to wear. I had put it on and not taken it off since, and I told myself it was because consistency of appearance mattered for the performance. Foster? The immigration officer appeared at the door. Tommy stood first, and then his hand was at the small of my back. The warmth of his palm pressing through the thin fabric of my shirt with the confident familiarity of someone who had been doing this for years, and my entire nervous system staged a small but extremely organized riot. Ready, he murmured. Just for me, low enough that it would not carry. Completely, I lied. We passed the interview. We had rehearsed for weeks, not just the facts, but the texture of them, the way couples talk about their shared life differently than strangers, the particular grammar of intimacy that cannot be faked by recitation alone. Tommy had suggested the approach. Instead of memorizing scripts, he said we should simply talk about everything, about our actual days and actual preferences and actual opinions, so that the facts about each other would be real ones even if the relationship was not. It was, I later realized, either very smart or very dangerous, and the distinction between those two things would take me months to fully appreciate. He had a photographic memory for details, which was both impressive and slightly unsettling. When the officer asked him what my morning routine looked like, he described it accurately, down to the fact that I apparently always leave a cupboard door open when I am distracted, which he had observed from exactly 3 mornings of preparation sessions at his apartment before the interview. I had not even known I did that until I heard him say it. He pays attention to you, Sable had said when I told her, and her voice had the careful neutrality of someone choosing not to editorialize. Sable was our mutual friend, the architect of the introduction, and she had known Tommy for years and me for 3. And she had been performing a very convincing performance of her own, which was the performance of someone who had made a casual suggestion and not in fact engineered the whole situation with malice aforethought. He pays attention to everything, I had said. It's a skill. Sure, said Sable. On the steps outside the building, with the afternoon light slanting gold across the pavement, I breathed for what felt like the first time in 3 hours. You did well, Tommy said beside me. You were the one who remembered the open cupboard thing. I pay attention. A pause. You looked like you needed backup. That was the moment I should have cataloged carefully and filed away under danger, do not engage. Instead, I just nodded and told myself the warmth in my chest was relief about the visa. Living with Tommy Hardy was an education in contradictions. On paper, and I had read a great deal about him on paper, because thorough research was how I managed uncertainty, he was a businessman. The kind of business person who had appeared in a handful of industry profiles that described him as strategic, decisive, results-oriented. The profiles had photographs in which he looked exactly as he did in real life. Composed, direct, the kind of attractive that made interviewers apparently forget to ask the challenging follow-up questions. The profiles did not mention that he cooked, not perfunctory cooking, not bachelor efficiency cooking, but real cooking. From scratch, with attention and patience, and the kind of investment in process that suggested he found it genuinely satisfying rather than merely necessary. The first time I came home to the smell of something slow cooking and found him standing at the stove in a plain gray shirt with his sleeves rolled up, reading a business report that he had propped against the spice rack with the casual multitasking confidence of someone who has done this many times, I stood in the doorway for longer than was dignified before announcing myself. "Sit down," he said without looking up. "It's almost ready. You didn't have to." "I was cooking anyway. Sit down, Robin." My name in his mouth was a thing I started noticing around week 3. The way he said it. Not curtly, not with performance, not with the slightly elevated warmth of someone playing a role for potential observers, just evenly. Like it belonged there. Like it was simply his word for me. Our apartment was large and thoughtfully arranged in the way that suggested someone had spent time thinking about how a space was actually used rather than how it was supposed to look. Tommy had given me the room with the better light and the window that overlooked a narrow garden that was currently just beginning to tip into late autumn, and he had not made a production of it. He had simply pointed to it on the day I moved in and said that room works better for you. When I had asked how he knew, he had shrugged. "You had plants," he said. "In your old place. Your friend mentioned it. He had asked our mutual friend about my plants." I told myself this was simply due diligence for a convincing performance. Knowing your supposed partner well enough to make appropriate housing decisions was good cover story material. I told myself this for about 2 weeks before I stopped believing it. The apartment had a living room where his books lived in organized rows and my research folders gradually accumulated in a territory that expanded from the designated corner over the first month and a half, until Tommy wordlessly cleared a shelf in the bookcase and I reorganized without comment, and we both pretended this was not a negotiation and an accommodation and a small act of sharing. We fell into a rhythm. Not the artificial performance for external observers rhythm we had rehearsed, but something quieter and more genuine. Morning coffee made before the other was awake, an act that began as pragmatic. The machine made 2 cups efficiently and became something else. Shared evenings where he read and I worked on my research, the comfortable parallel presence of 2 people who did not need to be talking to be in good company. Weekends where we wandered separately through the same apartment and somehow always ended up in the same room. It was the ending up that I noticed first. However, we started our Saturdays, he at his desk, me on my laptop, both of us with distinct plans and separate projects. By mid-afternoon, we would have converged somewhere. The kitchen, usually, or the living room, with his book and my laptop both open and no formal decision made to be in the same space. It simply happened, the way water finds its level. I mentioned this to Sable on a phone call and she made a very non-committal sound. One night I woke up at 2 in the morning with my mind spinning about my research grant application, specifically about the methodology section, which I had written and rewritten 4 times and which was not working in ways I could feel but not yet articulate, and found him already awake. Sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water and a notebook open in front of him. He looked up when I appeared, not startled, as though my appearing was within the range of things he had considered possible. "Can't sleep," he said. "Same." I pulled out the chair across from him and sat without asking, which I noted was a small departure from the careful courtesy of our early cohabitation. "What are you working on?" Trying to figure out how to tell my grandfather's board that the ESG metrics they submitted are wishful thinking without using the words wishful thinking. "ESG, I said. "Environmental Social Governance." He looked at me. "You know it. It's adjacent to my research. Corporate Environmental Responsibility Reporting. I have opinions about it." "Show me." I looked at the notebook. That was going to be my line. He turned the notebook toward me. His handwriting was precise and slightly angular. The handwriting of someone who has learned to write efficiently rather than decoratively. And I read through his notes with the focused attention I gave everything that interested me, and then I started talking. We talked until 4 in the morning. about corporate environmental responsibility and the way companies dress up inadequate practices in language designed to obscure rather than illuminate, about the difference between optics and actual impact, about the various mechanisms by which sustainability commitments could be made genuinely binding rather than aspirational, about what it would take for boards to treat environmental metrics with the same rigorous scrutiny they apply to financial ones. His questions were sharp and real. He pushed back on two of my points with specific counterarguments that demonstrated he had actually thought about this and not just absorbed my framing, and I pushed back on his counterarguments. And somewhere in the middle of that third exchange about the measurability of social impact metrics, I realized I was smiling, and had been for some time. When I finally said goodnight and stood to go back to my room, the gray pre-dawn light already beginning at the window, he said quietly, "Thank you, Robin." "For what?" "For taking it seriously." A pause. "For taking it seriously." A pause. "The work I do isn't always treated as the kind of thing that intersects with what people like you do." It was good to talk to someone who could see the connection. People like me. Environmental researchers. People who spent their careers trying to make the language of science legible to the people with power to act on it. "I'll send you some reading," I said. "If you want." "I want," he said. I lay in bed afterward and stared at the ceiling and understood, with the clarity of someone who has been avoiding a thing and can no longer pretend it is not there, that I was in serious trouble. Month 2 brought Tommy's work complications into the shared space of our life in ways I had not anticipated. The company, which I will call Hardy Group because that is what it was going through a transition that was more fraught than Tommy's calm exterior suggested. His grandfather was stepping back. The board was adjusting. Dex, the cousin who stood to inherit the controlling shares if Tommy's marriage requirement was not met, was maneuvering in the way of someone who believed their moment was arriving and was making sure everyone noticed. I knew some of this from what Tommy told me, which was careful and measured as he was with everything. I knew more from the fragments of phone calls that carried through the apartment walls, not eavesdropping exactly, but the reality of shared space is that voices travel, and the particular quality of the silence after those calls, which had a texture I learned to read. One evening, he appeared in the doorway of the room where I was working, and instead of his usual settled stillness, he was carrying something tighter, something that looked, on Tommy Hardy's extremely composed face, like strain. "I'm going to make tea," he said. "Do you want some?" He never offered tea at 9 in the evening unless something had happened. "What happened?" I said. A pause. He leaned against the doorframe. "My grandfather called. He's moved the timeline up. He wants to formally introduce us, to the full board in 6 weeks, not 4 months. Introduce us how? As a couple. He wants them to meet you." He looked at me steadily. "I understand this is not what we agreed to in terms of the scope of public presentation. If it's too much, it's not too much," I said. "I agreed to maintain the partnership publicly. This is public." I paused. "Tell me about these people. I'll learn what I need to know." He looked at me for a moment with the expression I had not yet fully decoded, the one that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. The look of someone encountering something they had not fully expected. "Sit down," he said. "I'll make the tea and tell you about everyone." We sat in the kitchen until midnight, and he told me about the board with the careful, specific detail he brought to everything important, and I listened and asked questions. And somewhere in the telling I understood that he was not just briefing me as a co-conspirator, but was in some essential way letting me in, sharing something he held close, trusting me with it. I accepted that trust with the care it deserved, and did not examine too closely what it meant that it mattered to me to deserve it. The complication arrived in the more immediately physical form of Tommy's cousin Dex at the board introduction function 6 weeks later. Dex Hardy was everything Tommy was not. Loud where Tommy was quiet, performative, where Tommy was genuine, the kind of man who smiled with his teeth and watched the room for reactions at the same time, so that the smile never quite reached his eyes because his eyes were always busy doing something else. He appeared at the function, a private dinner at his grandfather's house, formal and weighted with the specific significance of family business, and he shook my hand with both of his and held it just a beat too long. "So you're the one who finally caught him," Dex said. His voice had the warmth of someone performing warmth. "We caught each other," Tommy said from beside me, and his hand found mine and stayed there, and he was saying it for the performance, for the observers, for the charade, and I knew that. And I held his hand back and smiled and kept telling myself I knew that. Tommy's grandfather was a different proposition entirely. Edwin Hardy was 81, sharp as winter, and looked at both of us across the dinner table with the direct attention of someone who had built something real from nothing and knew exactly what he was doing. "You're a researcher," he said to me, not a question. "Environmental science," I said. "Fellowship research currently, sustainability metrics and their practical implementation." Edwin's eyes moved between me and Tommy with the quality of someone who is not fooled by surfaces. "He's never brought anyone here before," he said. "I know," I said, which was true. "What do you make of him?" I looked at Tommy, who was watching me with the careful stillness of someone who has surrendered a moment to someone else and is trusting them with it completely. "I think he pays attention to things that matter," I said. "And he takes his time with decisions. And he means what he says." I paused. "I think those are reasonably good qualities." Edwin looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, they are," in the tone of someone closing a subject they have found satisfactory, and turned the conversation to something else. Tommy's hand pressed mine briefly under the table. Just once. Just for a second. I told myself it was performance. I was running out of things to tell myself. The function lasted 4 hours. People who had known Tommy for years asked me questions with the friendly sharpness of people trying to find inconsistencies, and I answered everyone cleanly because Tommy and I had talked, for months now, and I knew him in ways that did not require memorized facts. I knew that he took his coffee with exactly 1 spoon of sugar and would not drink it if it had too much milk, because he found the color wrong, and that this was such a specific and faintly absurd preference that it had made me laugh the first time I observed it, and he had looked at me with the particular expression of someone who knows their preference is faintly absurd and is making peace with it. I knew that he went very still and very quiet when he was genuinely angry, which was rarer than people around him seemed to expect, and that the quiet was far more significant than any loudness would have been, and that the best response to it was to wait, not to fill the silence. I knew that he laughed most freely when something surprised him, a genuine, open laugh that he seemed slightly startled by each time, like his own amusement caught him off guard and delighted him. I knew these things because I had been watching him the way I watched everything that interested me, carefully, continuously, with the part of my brain that never quite switches off. That is always cataloging and cross-referencing and building a picture from accumulated data. The picture I had built of Tommy Hardy over 4 months was detailed and specific, and had stopped resembling data at some point and started resembling something else, which I was not yet ready to name. After the function, we stood in the elevator going back up to the apartment, and the silence between us was a different texture than usual. Not the comfortable parallel silence of 2 people at ease, but something with more current in it, something that felt like the aftermath of a storm that hadn't quite broken. "You were perfect," he said finally. His voice was quiet. "We were convincing," I corrected, because I was suddenly very careful about language. He looked at me sideways. "Yes," he said. "Convincing." The way he said it gave the word a second layer that I spent the entire night thinking about. 4 months into our arrangement, my research fellowship was awarded. I found out on a Friday morning and stood in the kitchen holding my phone and not entirely sure what I was feeling, which was unusual for me. Usually, I am quite clear about what I am feeling, even when what I am feeling is complicated. This was a specific kind of overwhelm that I had not encountered before. Not quite joy, not quite relief, not quite disbelief, but some combination of all 3 plus something else underneath that I would need time to identify. Tommy walked in, took one look at me, and stopped. "What happened?" "I got the fellowship." My voice came out odd, high and thin. "The Environmental Research Fellowship. Full funding. 2 years. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and pulled me into a hug. It was the first time he had hugged me without a reason, without cameras or observers or the necessity of performance. No one was watching. No one would have known the difference. It was just him, arms around me, solid and certain and warm, and I stood there for a moment in genuine shock before my body figured out what to do and my arms went around him back. "Congratulations," he said into my hair. "That's extraordinary, Robin." It's the thing I've been working toward for 3 years, I said into his shoulder. I know. He said it simply and it was true. He did know. He had listened to me talk about it across dinner tables and late nights and early mornings, had asked good questions and remembered the answers, had pointed out a structural weakness in my preliminary application abstract in a way that I had initially resisted and then incorporated, which had made it significantly stronger. He had cared about the outcome in a way I had never asked him to, and that was completely outside the terms of our contract. We stood there longer than necessary. Neither of us moved first. We just gradually, quietly stepped back from each other with the awareness of two people who have been holding each other and are now figuring out where to put their hands. He went to put the kettle on. I sat down. We had tea, and he asked careful questions about what the fellowship meant for my research timeline, and I answered, and neither of us mentioned the hug. But I thought about it for days. I thought about the way he had moved toward me without hesitation, the way holding on had been the instinct rather than a performed response, the way he had said "I know" with the certainty of someone who has genuinely been paying attention. I thought about how the word congratulations had sounded in his voice, warm and real, carrying the specific weight of someone who was genuinely glad. I thought about it, and I made the very sensible decision to think about something else instead, which worked for approximately 3 days before stopping working entirely. The pregnancy form arrived 5 months into our arrangement, which was 3 months longer than it would have taken to find out it was not about pregnancy at all. But forms are forms, and the immigration system has its own internal logic that answers to no one. It was, technically, a supplementary documentation request. One of the boxes on the form, under a section about family unit verification, asked for the name of any co-parent or secondary guardian for dependents in the household. There were no dependents in our household. This was not a form we needed to fill out. I had pulled it from the stack of immigration paperwork I was working through that afternoon as part of my meticulous management of our legal situation, cross-referencing everything against the requirements list, flagging what was relevant, setting aside what was not. Tommy found it in the set-aside pile. He held it up with the particular quality of attention that meant he was about to find something funny, which was a look I had cataloged precisely because it appeared rarely and was always worth watching for. It asks for the father's name, he said. We don't have a dependent. I know. The form doesn't apply to us. I know. The corner of his mouth moved. It's still asking. I looked at the form, then at him. The kitchen was afternoon quiet, the light from the window falling at its particular late-day angle, and something about the moment, the absurdity of it. The form sitting between us asking a question about a future that did not technically exist. The way he was looking at me with amusement and something else underneath the amusement opened a door in my chest that I had been keeping firmly shut for approximately 2 months. "What would you put?" I asked before I could think better of it. He set the form down. The kitchen was very quiet. "What do you mean?" Hypothetically. If it applied to us. "What would you put?" He looked at me for a long time. The amusement had settled into something else, something that was careful and direct at the same time, the way he was when he was choosing his words precisely. "I put mine," he said. The door in my chest swung open all the way. I sat with that for approximately 4 seconds before I stood up abruptly and said I needed to go check on something in my room and left the kitchen, which was possibly the least dignified exit I had ever made in my life. I was a person who prided myself on composure and measured responses and not making choices before I had thought them through. I had just fled a kitchen because a man had said 4 words. I sat on my bed with my knees to my chest and gave myself a very stern internal lecture. This was an arrangement, a contract, a mutually beneficial, legally structured, temporary arrangement with a predetermined endpoint. I was not supposed to be sitting here reconstructing the exact quality of Tommy's voice when he said I'd put mine, the evenness of it, the complete absence of performance, the way it had landed like something that had already been decided, and feeling like I had just had the floor removed from underneath me. I was, by any objective measure, an intelligent person. I'd managed graduate school, a master's thesis, 3 years of competitive research fellowship applications, the bureaucratic labyrinth of immigration law, and a covert marriage. I was not someone who got undone by implication. And yet, Tommy knocked on my door. His knock was always the same, twice, evenly spaced, never demanding. "Robin." "I'm fine," I said, which was an objectively ridiculous thing to say because he had not asked. I didn't say you weren't. A pause. I heard him shift his weight outside the door. Can I come in? I should have said no. I should have said I needed space, needed time, needed the emotional equivalent of a cold shower and possibly several hours of extremely dry research literature. Instead, I said yes, and the door opened and he leaned against the frame with his arms crossed, in the way he did when he was being careful, looking at me with that amber gaze that had become so familiar over 5 months that it felt like something that had always been there. Something I had known before I knew it. I wasn't trying to complicate things, he said. His voice was even and quiet. You didn't, I said, which was so obviously a lie that both of us could hear it. Robin. Tommy. Can you stop for one moment being extremely competent and just tell me what you're thinking? I stared at him. Something about the way he had phrased it, extremely competent, said not as a compliment but as an observation about a habit, hit differently than I expected. You want me to tell you what I'm thinking? Yes, right now. Ideally. I breathed in slowly, then out. Then I said, because apparently I had arrived at the end of careful, I'm thinking that somewhere in the last 5 months I completely failed to maintain the emotional detachment that was explicitly specified in our contract. And I don't know what to do with that information, and the form was funny, but also it wasn't, and when you said you'd put your name, I felt something I can't categorize as anything other than. I stopped. He had moved away from the doorframe. He was closer now, standing at the edge of the small space between us, and his expression was the one I did not have a name for. Not the professional composure, not the private amusement, not the careful attention, but something that felt unguarded in a way I had not seen from him before. Something raw and direct and entirely serious. Other than what? He said. Real, I finished. I felt something real, and that is very inconvenient given our situation. He sat down on the edge of my bed. Not far away, close enough that the mattress registered his weight, that the space between us could be measured in feet rather than in the much safer unit of rooms. I stopped maintaining the emotional detachment approximately 3 months ago, he said, with the matter-of-fact precision he brought to everything, which somehow made it more devastating than any alternative phrasing would have been. I did not say anything because you seemed like you needed the structure of the arrangement, the clarity of it. I didn't want to take that from you. The care in that statement, the specific considered attention to what I needed rather than what he felt, the choice to hold himself at a distance because he thought that was what I required, did something entirely unfair to my ability to breathe. 3 months, I said. You've been not saying anything for 3 months. I have been very not saying anything, he agreed. It has been an effort. Tommy, I know this is complicated, he said. I know the contract and the visa and the fact that this started as a transaction and all the very sound reasons why complicating it is not what either of us planned for. He paused, and in the pause was the specific weight of someone who has decided to say the true thing. I also know that I think about you constantly and find reasons to be in whatever room you're in and have memorized the way you look when you're reading something that genuinely excites you. And that I asked your friend about your plans before I met you because I wanted to know something real about you before we sat down to negotiate. And that this went somewhere I did not plan for and am not willing to pretend otherwise anymore. He asked about my plans before we met. Before we even sat down at that coffee shop table, he had been trying to know me. I think about you constantly too, I said. For the record. The startled smile appeared. That open, unguarded quality of his real amusement, the kind that caught him off guard. I know, he said. You're not as subtle as you think you are. You're also not as subtle as you think you are. The open cupboard thing was too much. It really was. We looked at each other across the small distance still between us and the contract and the visa and the practical considerations and all the careful structures we had built arranged themselves into irrelevance. And I reached over and took his hand and he turned his palm up immediately without hesitation, as though his hand had been waiting, and held on. We did not rush it. That was the thing I would think about afterward when I tried to trace the line between arrangement and reality, the fact that even once we had named what was happening between us, we moved at our own pace, without performing it for anyone, without turning it into an announcement or a decision that required external validation. The first time he kissed me was a Wednesday evening in the kitchen where everything important in our relationship had apparently decided to happen. I had been telling him about a discovery in my research data, a significant one, the kind where the numbers line up in a way that suggests the hypothesis is going to hold. And he had been listening with his full attention, the way he always did. And somewhere in the middle of my explanation, I had turned to gesture at the laptop screen and found him much closer than I expected. The look on his face was so unguarded that I stopped mid-sentence. "You were saying something," he said. "I was," I agreed. "About carbon sequestration rates." "Yes. Do you want to finish?" I looked at him, the amber eyes a small honest curve at the corner of his mouth. The man who had asked about my plants and listened to me until 4 in the morning and held my hand back without hesitation and said, "No, not right now." He kissed me like he did everything else. Attentively, without hurry, like it mattered, and he had thought about it and was not going to do it carelessly. His hand came up to my jaw and mine found the front of his shirt. And I held on, and when we finally pulled back we were both very still for a moment. And then he rested his forehead against mine and exhaled the specific exhale of someone releasing something they have been carrying. "Carbon sequestration," he said, into the small space between us. "I'll tell you later," I promised. "I know you will," he said with the warmth of someone who is genuinely glad about this. The weeks that followed were a process of gradual reconstruction, not of our arrangement into something new, but of our existing reality into something we could now both see clearly. We stopped performing and started simply being, which turned out to be almost indistinguishable from the outside but felt completely different from inside. The difference was in the permission to reach for his hand without calculating whether it was necessary to lean into him when we were reading side by side on the sofa, to say goodnight in the hallway with the specific warmth of something meant rather than managed. He brought me coffee in the morning sometimes before I was fully awake, setting it on my desk with the one-spoon precision and leaving again without requirement of acknowledgement. And I found I loved him for it in the specific way I was learning to love him for things, not with fanfare, but with the quiet accumulation of understanding that this was the shape of who he was. I used the word loved in my own internal monologue for the first time on an unremarkable Sunday when he was on the sofa with his book and I was at the table and we were not talking, just occupying the same space in the good way, and I thought about how natural it had become and used the word and then sat quietly with it for a while to see how it felt. It felt true, which was what I had learned to look for. Telling Sable was one of the more entertaining conversations of my life. She had been our mutual friend and the architect of the introduction, had known Tommy for years and had met me in graduate school, and had taken the entire visa arrangement with the specific brand of resigned affection of someone who knew both parties well enough to see what was coming before they did. When we told her, together over a 3-way video call, with the particular mixture of sheepishness and defiance that comes from reporting something you know sounds absurd, but are not actually sorry about, she was quiet for approximately 2 seconds. "I know," she said. "You know," Tommy said. "Tommy, I have known you since you were 22 years old. Robin, I have known you since your first graduate seminar when you argued with the professor about the scope of longitudinal environmental data and were entirely correct. Did you genuinely think I couldn't see exactly where this was going when I made the introduction?" There was a pause. "You matchmade us," I said. "Using a visa marriage. I provided an infrastructure," Sable said serenely, "within which two people who were catastrophically suited to each other could encounter one another in a context that gave them both a legitimate reason to spend sustained time together before either of them could run away from it." Pause. "You're welcome." Tommy looked at me. I looked at him. The small private communication between us said, clearly, she is entirely smug about this and has completely earned it. "Thank you," Tommy told her. "You're very welcome," Sable said. "Now, what are you going to do about the legal situation?" The question of making it real was more complicated than it sounded, because the legal marriage we had contracted for already existed. We were, on paper, married. Had been for 5 months. The paperwork was filed and recognized. "We're already married," I pointed out one evening. "We're married for visa reasons," Tommy said. He was in his study, where I had taken to spending evenings because the company was better, sitting in the chair across from his desk with my laptop while he reviewed documents. "That's different. Legally speaking, it is not different." "I know." "Then, Robin." He set his papers down. I want to marry you because I want to marry you, not because of a contract, not because of a deadline or a grandfather's will or an immigration requirement. A beat. I want to ask you properly and have your answer mean what it should mean, not what it was contractually required to mean. I sat with that for a moment, feeling the specific weight of it. Properly, I said. Yes, as in, you're planning to propose. I have been planning to propose for approximately 6 weeks. I stared at him. 6 weeks. I was waiting for the right moment. He had the grace to look slightly abashed, which on Tommy Hardy's face was very subtle but was present. You are very focused when you're working. I did not want to interrupt something important. Tommy Hardy, you have been sitting on a proposal for 6 weeks because you didn't want to interrupt my research. When you say it like that, ask me now. He blinked. The startled smile, the open, unguarded delight of being caught off guard. He reached into the drawer of his desk, which meant he had been keeping the ring in his desk for what I was now calculating had been 6 weeks. And he came around the desk, and he did not get down on one knee. He knew me had been paying attention for months, and understood that I would find it uncomfortable, and instead he stood in front of me and held out the ring. It was different from the one I'd worn before, not because the pawnshop ring was not beautiful, it was, but because he had wanted to choose something that belonged to what we actually were rather than what we had agreed to be. This one was a deep-colored stone, rich and warm, set simply, the kind of thing that looked like it had been chosen for a specific person by someone who knew that person well. I want to make this real, he said. Not the paperwork. That part exists already. I mean the rest of it. All of it. The late nights and the open cupboards and the carbon sequestration and the board dinners and the 3 months of me not saying anything that I am extremely relieved are over. He held my gaze. I love you. I have loved you for a while now, and I should have said it sooner than this. Will you marry me in the way that actually means something? I looked at him, at the ring, at the specific, unperformative honesty of his face, at the life that had accumulated around both of us in the space of months without announcement, one small, real moment at a time. Yes, I said. Obviously, absolutely yes. He put the ring on my finger and I pulled him into a kiss, and somewhere in the background his phone sitting on the desk. Received a message from Sable that said, finally, in capital letters that we did not see for 20 minutes. 3 months after the reproposal, my fellowship research required me to spend 6 weeks at a field site 3 time zones away. It was not negotiable, and I would not have wanted it to be. The field work was the core of the research, the irreplaceable empirical foundation for everything else, and I had been working toward it for years. But negotiable and easy are different things, and the prospect of 6 weeks away from what had become, without my fully noticing, the center of my daily life, was something I had feelings about. Tommy had listened to my agonizing for approximately 2 evenings before saying, with his characteristic precision, "Robin, go do your research. I'll be here. You make it sound simple." It is simple. He looked at me steadily. The complicated part was the first year. This is just geography. He was right. He was, irritatingly and reliably, almost always right about things like this, which I had learned to appreciate rather than resent, though it had taken a few months of practice. The morning I left, he made breakfast and stood in the kitchen with his coffee and watched me check my bags one final time with the expression I had come to know as his particular kind of patient, which was not resigned patience but the active, deliberate kind, the kind that meant he had already accepted the thing and was now simply being present in it. At the door, he kissed me and said, "Send me the data when it starts to look interesting. You want my raw field data. I want to know how the research is going." A pause. "I also want something that is genuinely yours to read while you're away." I thought about that on the plane for a long time. We video called every day, not because we had scheduled it or agreed to it, but because by the end of the first day apart, I had found myself composing things I wanted to say to him in my head and had simply called. And he had answered on the second ring with his reading glasses on and a book open beside him and said, "I was going to call you in an hour," and I had said, "I know," because I did. 6 weeks of long-distance calls gave us something unexpected, a different kind of intimacy. Without the shared physical space, without the proximity of simply being in the same apartment, we talked more deliberately, chose what to share with more intention. He described his days in the precise, measured way he had with everything. The board meetings, the ongoing tensions with Dex, who had apparently not entirely accepted the situation, the small domestic events of the apartment, a plant I had left in his care that had put out a new leaf which he reported with the gravity of a significant development because he understood it was significant to me. I described mine, the texture of the field site, the way the data was coming, in the specific quality of quiet, in a place with no city noise, which was so different from any quiet I had known that it required adjustment. We argued about sustainable field research practices and whether the third monitor setup he had added to his office was excessive. It was, and I maintained this position from 3 time zones away without difficulty, and what we were going to do when I got back. "What do you want to do?" he asked one night when I was sitting outside the field station with the stars extraordinarily dense and clear overhead, the kind of sky you forget is possible until you see it. "I want dinner somewhere quiet," I said, "and I want to sleep in our bed and hear you moving around the apartment in the morning, the way you always do. That sound of someone just being there. A beat. I want the ordinary things." "The ordinary things," he repeated. His voice through the phone was warm and quiet. "They turned out to be the best things," I said. The pause on his end had a texture I recognized, the specific quality of his feeling something and choosing to be straight about it rather than managed. "Come home," he said. 31 days, I said. "I know. I've been counting." I sat under the extraordinary sky for a while after we hung up and thought about the word home and how it had come to mean something specific and inhabitable rather than just a concept, and felt very glad about it in a way that sat quietly in the chest, not requiring anything, just being. I came home to a clean apartment, a slow-cooked meal that he had timed to be ready when my taxi pulled up, and Tommy Hardy in the kitchen in a plain gray shirt with his sleeves rolled up, who looked at me when I walked through the door with an expression so undefended and direct, the pure, unmanaged reality of someone who is glad, that I dropped my bag in the hallway and walked straight to him. We stood in the kitchen, not talking. Just the solid, certain reality of being in the same space again, of having the ordinary things be ordinary again, of his arms and mine and the specific weight and warmth of a person you love who is not a concept or a voice through a phone, but a real, physical, present fact. "The third monitor," I said eventually into his shoulder. "It's staying," he said. "It's excessive. I love you," he said, which was a very effective conversational move because it was impossible to argue with and entirely true. "I love you too," I said. "The monitor is still excessive." He kissed me, which closed the argument. In the months that followed, we built something the way you build things that last, not with fanfare but with repetition, with the daily practice of 2 people choosing to show up for each other in small ways that accumulate into something significant. He came to my research presentations, not because I asked him to, but because he asked to come, and sat in the back of the lecture hall with his reading glasses and his complete attention, and asked questions afterward that were better than some of the questions from my colleagues which I told him, and he looked quietly pleased in the way of someone not seeking compliments but genuinely glad that his attention had been useful. I learned the rhythms of his work in ways that let me be useful to him, when to bring tea and when to leave him alone, how to read a board document and tell him which objections were technical and which were political, how to be present in the room at a formal event in a way that was specifically supportive rather than just ornamental. We had disagreements, not many and not serious but real ones, about his tendency to absorb stress rather than express it, which I understood because I had the same tendency and therefore recognized it from the outside more easily than from the inside, about my habit of making unilateral research decisions and then reporting them, rather than involving him in the thinking, which was an artifact of years of working alone that did not translate perfectly into shared life about the monitor, which we had agreed to disagree about and which remained a standing point of good-humored contention. We figured things out. That was the phrase I kept coming back to. Not that everything was easy. Not that we were perfectly matched in every dimension, but that when things needed figuring out, we figured them out together, with honesty and the mutual respect of 2 people who genuinely liked each other as well as loved each other, which is, I had come to understand, not a given. When the official immigration review came, the final one, the comprehensive review that would determine whether my status was adjusted to permanent residency, we sat across the table from the officer with our documents and our history and the genuine complete answers to every question. She was thorough and kind and professional, and she asked us the standard questions: how we met, when we decided to marry, what our daily life looked like, what our plans were going forward. We answered everything honestly, because everything honest also happened to be the story we had already told, and also because the distance between the performed version and the real version had collapsed so thoroughly that I could no longer always distinguish where one had ended and the other began. At one point, she asked what he found most challenging about our relationship. Tommy considered the question with his usual precision, the particular quality of consideration that meant he was not going to give a diplomatic answer but an accurate one. Learning to ask for what I actually wanted instead of structuring around it, he said. I'm thorough with plans. I had a plan, and the plan had terms, and I held to the terms even when the terms were no longer accurate, because that was tidier than saying the situation had changed. A pause. I would have liked to have said something sooner. The officer nodded and wrote something down, and I looked at him sideways, and the small private communication between us said, "Yes, that. Exactly that. And I'm glad you said it when you did." When we left with the outcome confirmed, and the papers signed, and the administrative dimension of our shared life formally in order, we stood on the same steps we had stood on more than a year ago, in the afternoon light that was the same gold slant color, and I thought about the person I had been that first time, careful and frightened and pretending to be neither. "We passed again," I said. "We don't have to pass anymore," he said. "It's just true now. It was always getting truer." He took my hand. Not for the cameras or the officer or the performance, just because it was the thing his hand did when mine was nearby, and we walked away from the building together. There was a dinner 2 months later with Tommy's grandfather. Edwin Hardy, at 81, was still sharp in the way of a much-used and well-maintained blade, and he had invited us, not to a formal function but to a private meal at his home, just the three of us, in a way that had the quality of something intended rather than social. Over the first course he talked about the company, about the early years of building it, about decisions he had made that he stood by and ones that time had shown him differently. He was, I understood, telling us something about what he valued, not instruction so much as testimony. Over the second course he said, without preamble, "You're the real thing." He was looking at me. I looked back at him. "I know," I said. "I didn't expect to be." Something in his face changed, a recognition, I thought, of honesty meeting honesty. "He didn't either," Edwin said. He glanced at Tommy, who was listening with the still attention he brought to things that mattered. I worried for a while. The timing of it. The speed. A beat. But that's not what worried me most. "What worried you most?" Tommy asked. "That you'd found someone who suited what you thought you needed," Edwin said, "instead of what you actually do." A pause. "And now?" I said. Edwin looked between us with the eyes of someone who has watched a great deal of life and knows what it looks like when something is real. "Now I'm not worried," he said. He poured more wine and changed the subject, and that was that. In the way that conversations that have said what they needed to say simply become other conversations. But Tommy's hand found mine under the table, briefly, and I squeezed back, and we had dinner with his grandfather in the easy, unglamorous way of people who have simply arrived at a life they actually want. A year after the final immigration review, sorting through the accumulated paperwork of a shared life, the receipts and documents and records that a life generates and that must occasionally be organized, I found the form again, the supplementary family documentation request, from the earliest months of our arrangement. The one with the box asking for the co-parent or secondary guardian's name. The form that had sat on the kitchen table between us, and opened a door that was already wanting to be opened. I brought it to Tommy, who was in his study with his 3 monitors and his book and his coffee, with exactly 1 spoon of sugar, and I set it on the desk in front of him. He looked at it, then up at me, then at it again. "You kept it," he said. "It seemed like it was going to be important. When did you know it was going to be important?" "About 30 seconds after I asked you what you'd put," I said. "And you didn't answer immediately. You considered the question." He picked up the form, looked at the box. Then he picked up the pen from his desk and, with the perfectly serious expression of a man completing a required administrative task, wrote his name in the box. Tommy Hardy. He set the pen down. "There," he said. I laughed, the kind of laughter that comes from somewhere deep and uncomplicated, from genuine happiness that does not need to announce itself or perform for anyone. the kind I had not known I was capable of until I had something worth laughing with. I sat on the edge of his desk and he turned his chair toward me and we looked at the form together with the gravity of two people treating a piece of irrelevant paperwork as exactly what it was, a small, private monument to the moment everything changed. It still doesn't apply to us, I said. No, he agreed. But, he said. He reached out and took my hand. In the ordinary, unremarkable, endlessly significant way he had been doing for over 2 years now. Outside the window, the afternoon light came through the room he had given me for the better light, the room that had slowly accumulated my plants and my books and my research notes and had quietly stopped being a guest room and started being something else, something that belonged to both of us in the way that whole life did. The plant on the windowsill had put out 3 new leaves since the one he had reported on from 3 time zones away. I had noted this with the specific satisfaction of someone who has kept something alive and watched it grow, which, I thought, was a reasonable metaphor for a number of things. "What do you want for dinner?" Tommy asked. "Whatever you're making." Terrible answer, I need a preference. Surprise me. He stood still holding my hand and pulled me gently up from the desk, and we went to the kitchen together the way we always did. In the life that had started as paperwork and become something that no form had ever been designed to contain. There is a certain kind of person who would call our story transactional, who would note the contract, the visa, the calculated exchange of mutual benefits, the utterly unromantic infrastructure from which the whole thing grew, and say that it is too procedural to be real love. Those people have never sat across a kitchen table at 4 in the morning with someone who asks good questions. They have never been known, specifically, accurately, with care, in the way that comes from another person paying close attention to you when there is no formal requirement to do so, when the attention is entirely chosen. Contracts can require proximity. They cannot require the moment when proximity becomes something else. They cannot require 2 in the morning and carbon sequestration and the specific quality of a laugh that catches someone off guard. They cannot require the 6 weeks of counting, or the proposal that waited because he did not want to interrupt something important, or the hand turned palm up without hesitation. Love is what happens in the gap between what the paperwork says and what is actually true. It is the open cupboard and the 1 spoon of sugar and the 31 days of counting. It is the proposal 6 weeks in the making and the 3rd monitor that will never be removed, and the fellowship that became dinner conversation, and the plants in the good light room, and the form that will never be filed, but lives in our desk drawer as a private artifact of the moment we both stopped pretending. The arrangement was 2 years. We are in our 3rd, with the comfortable, settled ease of people who have figured out how to be in each other's lives, not as a performance but as a fact. The company is Tommy's. My research is ongoing. Sable visited last month and spent an entire dinner being insufferably pleased with herself, which she had earned. Edwin calls on Sundays briefly, just to check in, and the calls have the warmth of someone who has found something precious in unexpected territory and is quietly glad about it every week. My name is Robin Foster. My husband is Tommy Hardy. We got married for visa reasons, in a pawn shop ring and a government waiting room, with rehearsed answers to questions we later learned how to answer without rehearsing. We stayed married because there was never going to be any other reasonable outcome, and we had both, it turned out, known that from much earlier than either of us had been willing to admit, because love is not always lightning and grand announcements and the kind of certainty that arrives fully formed. Sometimes it is the accumulation of ordinary things. The coffee and the cupboards and the books and the research and the late nights. Until one day you look up from the accumulation and understand that you are already home. He makes dinner. I leave the cupboards open. The plants in the good light room are thriving. Everything is exactly as it should be. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.